Welcome back, everyone. This is Ayad Boudiab, and we are proceeding with our Angular course. We have discussed a few things on how we download Angular, how we can start working with it. Just some getting started examples, how we can work with filters, right? We see how we can bind using the double brackets, and we can bind to some data. We display that on the in the browser, and then basically just how we can work in Angular overall, but we didn't dig into a lot of details. We saw filters, the details of the filters. This is very helpful, but now we're getting into more details on how we can work with Angular. And one of the key features that we will see discussing in this course over and over again has to do with the model view controller, right? So we ask ourselves, what kind of design pattern do we use when we're working with Angular? And if you look around and you do some research, you see a lot of people are saying it is MV whatever, model view something, right? Some people refer to it as model view controller. Others say it's model view model. So basically, just let's look a little bit at that concept, and we can dig more and more into those details as we progress through the course. But let's talk about that a little bit in here so we can have a better understanding. So for that purpose, I'm going to create a simple controller in this example and put that in a JavaScript file. And then I'm going to use that controller in my page and see how that show up, how that data will be displayed in the on the page. But before I do this, let me just look at a couple of things in here. So when I talk about model view controller, what are we talking about? So basically, we're referring to some type of model that represent our data, and then we have the view and the controller. In general, let's just put some text in there so we can have an idea of what we're talking about. So we get the model here, this is the view, and this is the controller. Of course, there's a connection here going on, and the model represents your data, right? So whatever you get from, let's say you made a call to a web service and you get your data back, that's your data, that's the model. And then you need to use your controller. Maybe you get some requests coming into the controller. That's usually how MVC works. You get requests coming into the controller and then interacts with the model, and then the data would make it to the view, and that would be displayed to the user on the screen. Now, the key concept in here as far as MVC is concerned is the separation of concerns. We don't have that data mixed up with everything else like we used to in other programming concepts. So right now, the view only displays the data. The model contains the data itself. So there is a separation of concerns in here, which makes it really easy if I want to test my application. Okay, so this separation of concern makes the testing of the application very simple. Now let's just take a look at something different in here as far as Angular is concerned. Okay, so we need to have the controller, and let's take the controller here. And that controller would have some set of data, and I need that data to make it to the view. Right? I need to display that data on the screen. Now, of course, the controller will use services, and services will interact with the models and get me that data. So the data is somehow in the controller, and I need to make that data available to the view. Right? So the view is then sitting here. This is the view. Let's put that view and remove one of the eyes. So we have the view in here, and as we have seen in our examples, the view would use some directives. For example, ng app, right? This is a directive that I need in my case. So this is the directive that I use pretty much all over my page, right? Anytime I need a specific directive, I refer to it. ng model, ng app, there's a ng controller. There's a lot of directives that I can use, and these directives are basically that's what the view would use, right? So this is the directives here, and the there's a connection, of course, between the view and the directive. Let's just undo this because I need a simple line that join them together, not with the double lines in there. So I put the line between view and the directive. It used those directives to get some work done based on those on what those directives would provide. But then I'm looking in here for the glue, the piece of information that basically bridges between the controller and the view. And that glue is the actual scope. And we'll talk about the scope in more details in our case. And here's the actual scope. And there is, let's just take a line, and that will be the connection between the view and the controller. And that's the, let's put a text in there, that will be dollar scope. Dollar scope, as far as Angular is concerned, is a service. And we'll see in our example, in our code, how that would work so I can make the data available to the view. But this is one of the key features that we need to keep in mind. When we're working with Angular, we get the scope as a service that gets some data from the controller and have that available to the view so I can display that data on the view. Okay, so let's keep this one in mind as we build our example. Here's back, we are back in here on the main screen, and right now I need to build the actual controller. But another important piece of information that I need to keep in mind is that an Angular application starts with a module, right? The module is the, like you think about it as the root, and other stuff branches from it. So when we talk about the module and what else comes out of the module, we get the config, so we can set up some configurations and routes. We'll talk about routes later. Also, we get the view, the controller, we get the directives, we get the factory and the services that provide actual data to the controller. So all that is just branching out of the module. So the module is the root. Okay, and the way I create a module is basically by saying angular.module. So this is the root of the of our application. Remember in here when I used ng-app, we used that before, right? ng-app equal something, right? And then we put the name in there. Now in our case, we don't have an ng-app yet, so let's go create that module and give it a name and come back here and reference it. So here's my module.js. By the way, my module.js lives in my scripts. You see that down here. I'm referencing that after referencing the angular.js. So in this file, I'm going to create the module. First of all, it's be a good programming practice to, whenever you start your JavaScript file, to use strict mode, so that way some of the errors could be caught, because you know it's sometimes it's tricky in JavaScript to make some subtle mistakes that doesn't show up, and then your application would not work. So to be more strict and have exceptions thrown if something is not right, you use the strict option that you see up there on the screen right now. So after that, going forward, what do I need to create? I said I need to create an actual module, right? And how do I do this? By using angular.module. This is the first thing that I need to create in here, and you give it a name. In this case, let's call it my app. Okay, that's the name. And then modules can depend on other modules, right? And we can have a service depending on other service and so on. In our case, it's a small example. The module does not depend on anything else. That's why I specify an empty array. Means there are no other modules that this module depend on. Okay, now this is the module just created, named my app. Before I continue to bring that to your attention, going back to the controller, I'm gonna name this one my app, because that's the module that I'm creating, and that's why I refer to the ng-app in here as my app, because that's the module that I have. Okay, so this is the actual module. Then out of this module, I can create my controller that I was talking to you about earlier, right? Remember on the screen here when we had the controller, I need to create that controller, and I create that off the module. So angular.module, that will give me the module, and then I can say chain my commands, and I say dot controller. That's to create a controller. Let's give the controller a name. Let's call it test controller. All right, and then this controller is basically a function. That function would do some work. Okay, so this is the work that's done by this function. And let's go ahead and close that with a semicolon. So the body of the function is what I have for my controller. I know there's a lot of concepts that we're covering in here, and that's why I'm approaching this with a iterative approach. I'm just, every time we go over that again and again until it sinks in. So I know there's a lot of information in there, but that's the core concepts of Angular, and that's why we need to cover them. So this function, basically what the controller would do, it needs to use the scope. Remember the scope that I have in here, right? This is the scope. I can put things into the scope so they can be available to the view. Agree? Okay, now where is the scope? I'm going to pass the scope as a parameter to the function. Now, inside here, I'm going to add things to the scope. So I can say $scope dot, let's say I'm going to introduce something called welcome, right? So $scope.welcome equal, and in here I would say, for example, to the Angular course. Okay, so this basically what happens in here, as a quick recap, out of the Angular we created a module named my app. For that module I created a controller named test controller, and that test controller is a function that does some work. This function will take the scope, which is passed in as a parameter, injected in. That's based on the concept of dependency injection, and we'll talk about that more as we discuss it in other exercises. But right now I'll take the scope and I'll add a property to it named welcome, and then I'll give it some value. So now I have my module, I have my controller. Going back to the view, which is, this is the view, right? This is the HTML, therefore this is the view. And I refer to my app, that's the ng app that's I created in here. So that's my app, and now I need to use my controller in here to do the rest of the work. Okay, so in this case then I'm going to create a div. Okay, and close that here. All right, now inside this div I'm going to create a paragraph. Okay, and in here I'm going to use the welcome property that I added to the scope. Okay, so I'm going to say welcome, and then I'm going to use my double brackets, and then I will use the property welcome. Okay, so in this case then my intentions is welcome to the Angular course. I'm using this welcome here, right? This is the capital text welcome that show up as a static text, and this is the actual property that I'd like to use. Now, of course, I need to use the controller somehow. I need to refer to the controller so it can put things into the scope, right? Right now, I don't have that controller. And that's why, for example, in this div, I would use the ng controller. The ng controller equals, and then in here, I'll refer to the controller that I had on the previous page, which is test controller. Now that test controller had this property on the scope, this becomes part of the scope for this div. So therefore, the scope of this div contain a property named welcome. It will be able to bind to that and display it for me on the screen. Okay, now let's put underneath this div in here, this paragraph in here, another paragraph, and in here I'm going to put an input box. An input, and I'm going to use the ng model for this input and make that equal to, and I'm going to, before I forget, let's go ahead and close the input, and the ng model will also be welcome. So it is binding somehow to that welcome property again. So it's using this from the scope and use that as the model for this input box in here. I can use ng model for things like the input box, for the drop down, for the text area. I'll be able to use the ng model. Okay, so then the text for welcome to the Angular course should show up here and here, right? Okay, now let's go ahead and save and see what we have so far. Let's copy that and put it here. And it says, welcome to the Angular course. It bound to it, right? This is the actual property named welcome. This is the static welcome that I had before. And it says in here to the Angular course as well. Well, you know that in Angular, we have the two-way binding. Two-way binding means if I change the model, the view would change, and the other way around would work as well. So right now, if I bound to the model, and I'm using that inside the text box, means if I change the data for the model, the other piece would change. Okay, so let's say in here in the text box, I'm going welcome to the Angular course, and I'm going to type this is interesting. Watch what's going to happen on the screen. This is interesting. You see it showing up down here and in here. Why? Because it's binding to the data. It's a two-way binding, right? I have the view and I have the actual data. I'm using the ng model. Look at the ng model in here. We're using welcome, so does this one. And as the data change, it's being reflected up here as well. So this is how I can work with controllers, and that's how I can use two-way binding, right? You see the binding over here. This is how I can use ng model. That's how I can use ng controller. And that's how I can use ng app. Now, one thing I'd like to bring you to your attention before I wrap this one. You see in here, that's the div, right? For this div, I have set ng controller. That means the scope is available for this div. Agree? So now if you want to really use this controller and use the binding in other places within the page, then you better take this guy and put it up here in the body. Now that controller with the scope and everything is available to the whole body of the page. Okay, so pay attention to that as well. So this is how I can work with ng app, ng controller, ng model. We'll, again, as I said, we'll discuss a lot of that as we progress through the course. We'll keep repeating them using different examples and so on until we get the grasp of how we can work with the model view controller as far as Angular is concerned. So let's go ahead and move to the next lesson. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Ayad Boudiab, and you have a good day.